Good morning and good afternoon. My name is John Herbst and I run the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. We have a wonderful program for you today. We're going to present uh, Lubyanka Federation, how the FSB determines the politics and economics of Russia. This report is brought to you as part of a partnership between the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council and the Future of Russia Foundation. Before I go any further, I'd like to turn this over to Maria Logan, who represents the Future of the Russia Foundation, and we're grateful for their support for this project. Maria?
Yes, hello and welcome everyone. So I'm Maria Logan and I'm the trustee of the UK charity, the Future of Russia Foundation. Very happy to be here today and help present this report. Unfortunately, due to the sensitivity of their work, the team at the Dossier Center, which launched this report in Russia a month ago, asked me to explain the context of this report, and then hopefully our esteemed panel of experts can discuss this in more detail. So the Dossier Center was launched in 2017 and by Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who some of you may know as the former CEO of UKAS company, also a political prisoner in Putin's Russia for over 10 years, and a vocal critic of Putin's regime. So the Dossier Center tracks the criminal activity of various people associated with the Kremlin. Currently, power in Russia is held by a de facto criminal organization that operates from within Kremlin. The criminal organization consists of a complex web of individuals ranging from high-ranking politicians to regional police chiefs. The Dossier Center maps out this network, compiling extensive case files against corrupt individuals and the institutions they make and control. These reports will enable future Russian courts, as well as non-Russian courts, hopefully in other jurisdictions and enforcement agencies, to open criminal cases against corrupt criminals in and associated with the Kremlin. So I encourage everyone to visit the website of the Dossier Center. It's dossier.center. Unfortunately, they publish everything in Russian, but I know some of you here speak Russian and read Russian, and you can read their reports there, and some of their reports been received already some awards as done by, in collaboration with CNN and the New York Times. So I really encourage you to visit and read it firsthand. So to you, John.
Maria, thank you very much. Maria just said the most important thing, which is that this report, based upon very sensitive methods, has already been published in Russian. I should say the materials upon which this report has been published in Russian. This is an extract from that much larger data set, and I'll now go through the major findings of the report. Some of these findings are well known. For example, the influence of the FSB in political and economic life in Russia goes beyond the constitutional powers granted to the special services. The president of Russia, of course, Vladimir Putin, is directly in charge of the FSB. He directs it not just through the agency's leader, Alexander Bortnikov, but this is important, but also through representatives of various units within the FSB. Thus, there exists a multi-level FSB control over the system. This is actually something that was not necessarily well understood in the West, that the vertical of power is actual multiple verticals, all leading to Mr. Putin, but not going always through Bortnikov. And this is of some significance. Through another item, the president of Russia increasingly relies on information received from the FSB. Members of the special services with direct access to the president often use the organization not just for security purposes, but for their own financial and bureaucratic well-being. So it's part of factional struggle. Next, the members of Russian President Putin's inner circle hold sway over different parts of the FSB. Figures such as National Security Secretary Nikolai Patrushev, Rosneft Chief Executive Officer Igor Sechin, Rostec Chief Executive Officer Sergei Chemyezov, Gazprom Chairman Viktor Zubkov, and former Security Council member Sergei Ivanov form groups of personal allies within the special services in order to advance their own economic and political interests. They provide security but share among themselves information useful to solving their own problems. So again, The FSB is not simply a security organ. It's used for other purposes and also for factional purposes. Over the past 10 years, the FSB has taken control over many state institutions, usually by force or connivance. The Defense and Interior Ministries, the Investigative Committee, the General Prosecutor's Office, and other agencies have become dependent on the FSB. In other words, the FSB has infiltrated and exerts sway over other institutions. Members of the special services are also regularly influencing judges' decisions. This power imbalance among the government departments threatens the country's security. Now, I think the next item from the report is well known. The FSB's methods often violate the constitutional rights of citizens and still utilize some of the KGB's worst practices. Officers of the special services and employees of other government departments are dependent upon them. Torture of people, the violation of freedom of speech, the falsification of criminal cases, the raiding and seizing of private businesses without justification, and even participation in murders are part of the methods that they use. These methods are used not just in Russia but abroad. Representatives of the FSB systematically participate in corrupt schemes, including frequently organizing illegal financial dealings, especially in the banking industry. The FSB directly controls almost all illegal banking operations in Russia, at great profit to specific groups within the FSB and representatives of the different factions or clans within the FSB. There's also ad hoc opportunist corruption within the FSB as lower and mid level officers follow the lead of their superiors and use their positions to earn illicit income. Finally, the FSB is a tool of repression against opposition minded citizens and business people who find themselves on the wrong side of the Kremlin, individual officials or informal clans. As I think we all know, even American businessmen who have regularly been apologists for the Kremlin can wind up in trouble if they fall afoul of more powerful clans within the FSB network. With that, I'd like to give Luke Harding a chance to speak further about the report, and then we'll turn to our other panelists. Luke, over to you.
Thank you, John. Just to say briefly, I think this is a tremendously important report, a really kind of groundbreaking analytical document. And the reason why is that having worked in Moscow for The Guardian, I know it's a place of rumor, of disinformation, of shadows. And it's extremely hard to get kind of proper empirical information about the FSB, which is playing this kind of outsized role in Russian affairs. And certainly when I was there, that was one thing I tried to do as a reporter, to investigate the murder of Alexander Litvinenko, killed, you'll remember, in 2006 with a radioactive cup of tea by two FSB assassins. And it was clear that my inquiries were unwanted, and my encounters with the FSB were all unhappy. There were kind of invisible ghosts, if you like, who broke into my apartment and bugged it. This is what I was told by the British Embassy in Moscow. And I was even interrogated by the FSB at their pre-detention center in the Lubyanka, which was something of a one-sided conversation, to say the least. And so this report, I think, is groundbreaking. It sets out what the modern FSB does. And as Ambassador Herbst was saying, that there's a strong element of domestic repression that goes beyond what you might describe as a kind of normal domestic counterintelligence function. There is corruption, both private and on behalf of the state, control over banking operations, and there's political murder of enemies, both at home and abroad. Litvinenko, but also we've seen in my country, the UK, Sergei Skripal. And I think the report sets this all out admirably. And I would just say lastly, what it does is it sort of charts the growth after 2 decades of Putin from what was a kind of KGB style agency to something much bigger. I mean, the report talks about it as a super agency, a shadow government, the preeminent institution in Russia. And I think that's correct. And I think it really helps to demystify what is a complex and highly secret organization. Back to you, John.
Okay, thank you, Luke. Charlie, you have a perspective to offer. You used to work for the FBI in counterintelligence, and you understand precisely what the FSB is up to, certainly in the United States and maybe beyond. So please.
Thank you, Ambassador, and good day and good afternoon to everyone. I hope you can hear me. I'm not able to join you by video today. However, yes, in a 22-year career with the FBI, I had quite the opportunity to work with and against, in some situations, the FSB. I think since 2004, we have seen quite the transition of the organization and how it has become now the preeminent security service in Russia. The issue that I think the report reflects accurately, and from the sourcing of the report, which I think the Dossier Center has done a outstanding job in vetting the sourcing of the document, really shows a pattern of almost an agency for hire, not only at the hands of the corrupt activity they're engaged with, closely associated with the Putin administration, but also they are effectively outsourcing their capabilities, which we would normally in the United States and other democratic governments would seek to exact by legal process and a system of jurisprudence. I think what you see with the FSB these days is they're utilizing their capabilities and farming them out for a price tag to the private sector, to competitors, to those who may be deemed dissidents, and in ways that are harmful to the citizens of Russia and for us, as a civilized society when looking for law and order. I think the rule of law under the FSB since 2004 and the restructuring has eroded significantly in Russia. And I think that will be a challenge for us as we move forward in working with Russia, whether it be from a foreign policy perspective, whether it be a law enforcement and security perspective, and I believe from an overall diplomacy perspective. So I think at this point, in evaluating the report for its sourcing specifically, because I had the good fortune to collaborate with the Dossier Center on some aspects of the report, I found the report to be very well written, very well sourced, and its validity, I think, in the way they balanced their human sources with their open media sourcing was spot on.
Okay, thank you. In fact, your comments remind me of something I probably should stress. This whole event is a little bit unusual among the hundreds of events I've done at the Atlantic Council. Unusual because, for reasons of security, the authors of the report are not here presenting the report. And Charlie just mentioned the difficulties of sourcing and how this report has been done in a completely professional way, recognizing how sensitive this information is. And let me just underscore one more point again. The most interesting things about this report, the true revelations, are not about the evil doings of the FSB. We've known about that for some time. It's about the internal divisions within the FSB, the fact that this institution, which is always described as a pillar providing security to President Putin in Russia, is in fact characterized, at least partly, by serious factionalism and dissensions, which could have unpredictable consequences. And with that, I'd like to turn to Louise Shelley, one of the world's foremost experts on the combination of criminality and governance in Russia, corruption and governance in Russia. Louise, your comments on the report and the question of FSB corrupt practices, which I think are quite relevant here.
Thank you. And I very much enjoyed the report. My only suggestion is that if there could be some more sources provided in the English language translation, and I'll name a few that I think would be very helpful for an American audience or Western audience to understand more of what you're pointing out. The report talks about the consolidation of organized crime in the state with President Putin's initial period in St. Petersburg, it dates to 1998. However, in the period since around 1990, even just before the collapse of the Soviet Union, there began to be massive outflows of money as people connected to the party, and especially the FSB, or then the KGB, saw the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I would put this exodus of the billions and the link with organized crime even earlier. I remember talking to Los Angeles prosecutors in the mid-1990s who were seeing evidence of this because the criminals, or let's call them the FSB criminals, really liked the warm weather of California. What we're looking at now is billions overseas, and much of this has put to good use the skills that the security service developed in the Soviet era when they had to move clandestinely and move money from the Soviet coffers to run active measures, which we now know as fake news, but there are long historical precedents of this. And they had long experience of moving money covertly internationally. And that's what they've continued to do on a massive scale. And that's really undermining the capacity of Russia to diversify as an economy and its future security to develop a non-oil-based economy, because so much of the money is lying overseas and so much of it flows through banks, which are, as was pointed out in the report and mentioned earlier, have many officials on them who worked in the FSB and work in the FSB as advisors to this banking structure. So this financial system is very key to the exodus of massive amounts of capital. I think it would be useful for a Western audience to cite some of the research such as done by OCCRP, the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, and what they did on, say, Troika Laundromat and the movement of billions through Lithuanian banks. The English version talks about Danske Bank, but there's also more that's gone on through the Baltics, which is readable and accessible for an English-speaking audience, since the mass of the report and its research is in Russian. Another important point is the report and the summary in English talk about the role of corporate raiding and seizing property. And I think that's really important, and a Western audience needs more of that in English. Let me give you an example of a fascinating case, because the English language report talks a little bit about the Magnitsky case and Mr. Magnitsky, who died in prison. But some of the money that Magnitsky reported on as a whistleblower in the financial case wound up in New York City real estate. And the person who laundered the money, and this is called the Prevezon case, was defended by a lawyer named Visolitskaya, who we know as a representative of the security services. And she was here defending the money launderer who moved some of the Magnitsky money. And she was subsequently indicted in the Southern District of New York for her criminal falsehoods and her lying and undermining not just Russian criminal justice, but our criminal justice as well. So I think it's important to understand that these consequences and the impact on security are not just Russia's security, but our security and the integrity of our legal process.
Okay, thank you very much, Louise. Your comments about the economic impact of FSB activities is something that Irina Bordigan, a wonderful young Russian journalist, can discuss. So, Irina, tell us what you think of the economic impact of the FSB role has been in Russia. Unmute yourself, please, Irina.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you fine. Thank you for being here.
And thank you, Dossier Center, for this great, huge report that was very interesting to read. Even for me, it shed a lot of light on some dark spots. But on the influence of the FSB on the Russian economy, I can say for the last 5 years, we've seen an escalation of selective repressions. And FSB prosecutes governors, ministries, and businessmen. These people feel uncomfortable and they feel restricted because of constant surveillance of the FSB. Nobody knows who might be put under criminal investigation and why. Putin's goals here, because we can't underestimate Putin's role over the FSB and over the governance system of the country. So Putin's goal is to exercise control by keeping everybody off balance. That's his methods. And when you don't know what happens next and who is next to be arrested, you cannot think of future. And since 2014, the Kremlin has been compensating the sanctions by awarding government contracts to the companies, to the Russian companies. But with money comes the FSB. And and this makes these companies subject to FSB control and repressions. And that, of course, undermines Russian economy enormously.
Okay, thank you. But what you just said is very interesting because you say you mentioned that Putin has keep people off balance by having different folks to rely on. Is it, again, to me, the real eye-opening part of this report was the discussion of factional fighting and maneuvering, positioning within the FSB. Does this suggest that Putin's control may not be complete? In fact, this could be something, there could be developments internally which disrupt the vertical of power.
It's not an easy question because the FSB is huge structure. They have a central apparatus based in Moscow, and they have a huge. It's like monster, which have been acting across the country, and of course, units which is placed far from Moscow couldn't be fully controlled by Putin because they're doing what they want to do, but to some extent, all central apparatus is under Putin control. It's clear. There's no fact that they try to organize something against Putin or something without his will. It seems that the FSB is even under more Putin's control than it used to be 5 or 10 years ago, and the whole all security services are under more Putin's control than they used to be. That 10 or 12 years we have some open conflicts between the security services. They competed each other, they pour dirt on each other, and it then became these facts public. We don't have this now. So I'm not. It's very difficult to say to which extent it's under Putin's control, but I think it's very much under Putin's control, and no important decision could be made without Putin.
Well, let me just make this clear. I'm not suggesting that this factionalism might lead to some sort of direct challenge to Putin. What I'm suggesting is perhaps this factionalism would limit the ability of Putin to control the FSB for his own purposes, and could lead to disorganization and ultimately a weakening in the FSB.
I'm not sure that it could weaken it. It could weaken the FSB as a law enforcement agency or a structure that could be under control. But given the fact that they operate, partly illegally or very often illegally, it couldn't be like this.
Okay, understood. All right, Luke, coming back to you, do you think we've all noticed over the years a growing FSB role? We've noticed also the position of Kadyrov and his followers in Moscow. Is there any pushback, as you see it, against growing FSB influence in other organizations, in the Ministry of Interior, in the SVR, the GRU?
One thing that the report makes clear is the way the FSB is increasingly kind of cannibalizing other parts of the state.
Right.
And as Irina was saying, it's become a lot more powerful in the last 5-10 years. And previously, there definitely were these clan struggles in the 90s between the Interior Ministry and the FSB. When I was in Moscow, there was a major conflict between the FSB and the kind of drug agency, which even involved, this is about 2007, 2008, John, involved two groups of guys with Kalashnikovs facing off against each other, with Putin sort of stepping in and playing the role he always plays, which is one of supreme arbiter. But I think the FSB really has become preeminent. I mean, what's interesting is that over the last couple of years, we've been very focused on the GRU because of its role in American politics, its hacking operation in 2016, where GRU officers, intelligence officers, raided the servers of the DNC and so on. But actually, the FSB was doing the same thing, also hacking the DNC a few months before. And so we do see this kind of intra-agency rivalry between GRU, Russian military intelligence, between SVR, foreign intelligence, and FSB. And I think what's interesting, the theme, if you like, is the way in which the FSB has expanded its remit. So it used to be just domestic repression, like in KGB terms. Then it kind of grew to what you might call the near abroad, operations in Ukraine, the Baltic states, Finland, Georgia, and so on. But now, actually, it's got the same kind of global proclivities that the GRU always had. The KGB and the GRU were big rivals. And most importantly, I think it has Putin's ear. I mean, he ran the FSB, let's not forget. He was head of the FSB in 1998 before he became prime minister and president. And really, its rise to this kind of parastate entity has taken place on his watch. And as Irina was saying, of course, there are differences within the organization, but ultimately they answer to Putin and also they serve Putin. And their prime task is to protect him and to protect the political elite.
And do you think that the various different activities of factions within the FSB, as described in the report, may make them a little bit less efficient at defending Putin's interests?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's right. I think this is kind of permanent struggle between what you might call state interests, loosely defined, the sort of national interests, Russian sovereign interests. That's the stuff we kind of write about. We write reports about all the time. Is Russia in global affairs? And of course, you know that is a very important role in what the FSB does. But that's almost like the public project. The private project, which this report lays bare, is a more secret project, and it's in essence it's kleptocratic. And the goal really is not just to steal as much money as you can through various schemes that Louise was talking about, and to offshore that money in the West using the Western banking system, using Lithuania and so on. We've seen a lot of that, but it's also to defend the money you have stolen or your clan have stolen from predatory attack by other people inside the elite. And it's this kind of Darwinian jungle. I mean, it's a kind of ruthless place. And what we've seen in recent years is real kind of cadre insecurity, uncertainty, where prominent figures within the elite, economics minister, interior ministry people, are being arrested, governors being fired, and so on. And I don't know what other panelists think, whether this is strategic. In other words, you keep people off balance all the time because that's a way of asserting force and power, or whether it's just Russian bardak, chaos, incompetence, if you like, of what seems to be a pretty, perhaps not crumbling, but a pretty kind of fraying state run by a leader who's been in power too long and who is failing to move with the times.
Okay, thank you. I would just like to remind our audience that you can put questions into the Q&A app at the bottom of the panel, and we'll be taking questions from the audience in a few minutes. But now, Charlie, I'd like to come back to you. Again, you've been watching FSB. You were watching FSB activities professionally within the U.S. government for many years. Have you seen any signs of this factionalism within the FSB, which the report we're presenting today describes?
Yes, thank you for the question. what I have seen is over the years, there's been intense competition between the agencies, the SVR, the GRU, and now the FSB. Forgive me, I have an airliner going overhead here. I hope you can still hear me.
I hear you fine.
And with the factionalism, I agree with the other gentleman in saying that you are seeing, an erosion, I think, in any rule of law as it relates to the FSB and them carrying out their responsibilities as a domestic security agency. It would be akin to having in the United States the FBI as a rogue element operating at the behest of the highest bidder, engaged in criminal activities, which would include laundering money, illegal wiretapping, and being effectively private contractors to those who were trying to eliminate either rival businessmen, rival organized crime factions, and leadership. It has really become an organization that is rogue, in my opinion, and is at the behest of those who can pay for the services they offer and those who follow the leadership and what the leadership is doing. I think between Vladimir Putin and what Igor Sechin has done as in utilizing the FSB for activities above and beyond what we would consider state interests, goes to the point of the lack of adherence to any constitutional policies or protocols or requirements under the law. And I think as long as this continues, the FSB will garner further power domestically and globally, and you won't see the SVR and the GRU carrying out similar activities.
Okay, let me just again stress one more point for those who are watching. The Soviet Union and Putin's Russia has never been characterized by formal adherence to the rule of law. I think what's really interesting about this report is the description of activities within the premier agency in Russia today, the FSB, that are not driven by the interest of the president of Russia, the guy who in theory they are reporting to, but by their own personal interests and how that could get in the way of the vertical of power which Putin has effectively established. Now, again, I'd like to come back to Dr. Shelley. Louise, again, you've followed this issue of corrupt activities in Russia for decades. The money that, do you have an estimate of the monies coming out of Russia, the billions coming out of Russia, which if it were not for the corrupt system there, would be invested in the Russian economy?
It's in the tens of billions a year. So a year. And we're talking in the hundreds of billions in this period that we're looking at. So if we could think about what this would mean in investment in education, in investment in medical care. You asked today about the protests in the Russian Far East. Part of that is linked to the misuse of the criminal law against a locally elected official, but also the failure of the state to provide services for the citizens. And what we're looking at is the reason that Russia is falling so far behind economically, because this money has not been invested in infrastructure, and it hasn't been invested in entrepreneurship. Russia has an enormous talent of tech talent. Unfortunately, a lot of this tech talent is co-opted by the state. One crime network I studied, the former head of the crime network, got what I call a get out of jail free card from prison and became head of the national payment system of Russia. But so we have this linkage, but it's not providing for entrepreneurship, because whatever entrepreneurship exists is generally criminal entrepreneurship, and the dominance of the FSB and the tech center prevents an honest tech entrepreneurship, and therefore you've got to go to Silicon Valley to be a great tech entrepreneur, and Russia is not achieving in this way, and that's also a consequence of the FSB and its facility to corporate raid other structures and take them over. So people move their money overseas, or they lose their businesses as they're beginning to develop.
That's that's a terrific point. We did a report at the Atlantic Council a couple of years ago on the Putin exodus, the emigration from Russia of very talented people, especially in the IT sector. I mean, Russia has produced great international cyber criminals, but they haven't produced great international cyber firms. And I think the role of the FSB and other security agencies in Russia, the ability to take over companies, is a very important reason for that. Okay, Irina, over to you. Louise mentioned the use of the FSB, for example, in going after the governor in Khabarovsk. We've seen since 2012 stagnation in the Russian economy. It's worth noting that in 2013, when oil was still at over $100 a barrel, the Russian economy grew at less than 2%. Then you add the drop of hydrocarbon prices, international sanctions, and the Russian economy is really in a rut. Putin has maintained power in part by distributing, as already discussed today, economic largesse, state largesse, to his allies. But as the pot shrinks, he has less money to distribute. And it seems he has privileged the sons and daughters of his closest officials over, for example, regional governors. Is this a destabilizing tendency in Putin's style of governance? And might that explain the unrest in Khabarovsk? Irina, please unmute yourself.
What happened in Khabarovsk is very unusual for Russia, and it was surprising even for me because we don't have a lot of information from Russian regions because local media are paralyzed by the Kremlin, and we don't have a lot of independent pollsters. So we only have Lubyanka Center. So, but can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you. You're doing great.
So when it happened to Khabarovsk, there were a lot of discussions why it happened there, too far from Moscow, and why these people are so supportive of the former governor who was not the great effective manager or even an agent. There are a lot of compromising facts about him, but we concluded that it might be because the whole region is so against the Kremlin and it's so against the Moscow power, which sends its people to the regions and sends its businessmen to the regions to buy all successful assets, to buy all successful companies, and to suppress all local activities. So that's what the reason was not political. So it doesn't mean that they don't agree with Putin's foreign policy or interior policy. These people just don't want to see Kremlin's corruption in the region, and they don't want to see how the Kremlin despise them. That's what the reason behind the protest, and we don't know how long it will go on. So.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to now turn to audience questions, and let me just commend to everyone's attention really not the question, but this very smart observations from Bob Otto, which is in the Q&A section. Okay, now we have a question from Paul Carter. He asks, to what extent can we say that the FSB and other security agencies have taken on the old role of the Soviet Communist Party as a kind of parallel state organization? Luke, do you want to try your hand at that?
Can I?
If you want, you go first and then Luke.
No, Irina, you go first. Irina, you go first. I'll chip it. No?
I mean that during the Soviet times, when KGB was in power, the KGB was under party control. And every KGB unit, every KGB department has a party structure, and a party leader was more powerful than the KGB officer. The KGB officer. So it was not, normal democratic control, system of control, but it was some kind of control. Now the FSB is not under anybody's control, and they are operating absolutely on their own. Of course, they're subordinated to Putin, but they are not accounted to the parliament, and there is no any kind of public control. So that's the difference. And the KGB was a powerful structure, but in terms of doing what they want to do, the FSB is even in a better position.
Okay, Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, John, I would agree with that. And Irina is too modest to mention it, but she co-wrote a brilliant book called The New Nobility, which is taken from a quote by Patrushev, the then FSB chief, and Putin, who basically said 2 decades ago that the FSB had become Russia's new nobility. And I think that's right, that they are that they are a sort of feudal overclass, if you like. I mean, there's definitely a kind of neo-feudal element to much of this. I mean, we were just talking about people close to Putin who gobble up industries. And one thing I discovered from the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers and sort of tracking down these illicit money flows is quite often the daughters and sons of Putin's friends marry each other as if it's the 14th century to try and consolidate what is now billions and billions of billions. But just lastly, on Irina's point, I mean, the FSB, they really are above all law. I mean, one thing the report makes clear is that they can initiate or close down criminal inquiries. They can tell judges what verdicts to do, what verdicts to give. And the other thing is just on political murder, this used to be a kind of primarily a sort of GRU KGB function, but this is something the FSB is doing. And one person we haven't mentioned yet is Alexei Navalny. Now we don't quite know what happened to him in Siberia in August. We know he was poisoned. We know the German government, European governments say he was poisoned with Novichok, which is clearly a sort of state nerve agent and poison. You can't get hold of it down the road. You have to be a state to produce it and to deploy it. Now we don't know who did it, but I think the suspicion, and I'd be interested to know what other people think, very much points towards the FSB, and it certainly goes to the FSB's kind of primary mission, which is to protect Vladimir Putin and those people around him. And I think sooner or later we will find evidence of FSB involvement in this, and certainly Navalny himself has said that Putin is responsible.
I just wanted to.
Go ahead.
Can I say one thing? I think that when we think about the Soviet era, we think about the Central Committee and its activities with disinformation internationally and how it moved some of this with the help of the money, the activities with the help of the FSB. But I think it's this global function of the FSB today, just as was talked about moving money to Panama and being involved in malicious activities internationally, that we're seeing the type of role that was done by the Central Committee in the Soviet era being done much more by the FSB today. And in some cases, as we're saying, overshadowing the GRU in doing this and certainly giving it a run for its money.
Okay, thank you. I just want to return to Luke's point about Navalny. I think it's interesting too that he was poisoned in Tomsk, and he was there working on the regional elections. And I think that control by the Kremlin over the regions is a point to watch in Russian governance in the years to come, for reasons that I've already mentioned, which is as the economic pie shrinks, to follow up on Luke's point about this growing nobility. Part of the nobility is handing on your privileges to your children, which stifles the ability of people without connections but with merit and with ideas to prosper, is a weakness not just for the Russian economy, but also for Russian governance. Okay, we have a question from Sergio Germani. What is the relationship between the FSB or sectors within it and traditional organized crime groups in Russia, like in Tambov and etc.? Louise, I think this is a question for you.
Yes, I just wrote Sergio privately that I'm happy to hear from him after many years. I think that in the 1990s, you saw these groups being very prominent separately. There has certainly been a merger of them with governmental elite, and they are deeply involved, members of them, in laundering money, in engaged in corporate raiding, which often serves the interests of the FSB and Putin's elite. So there's an interesting amalgamation, and if you did a network analysis of them, you would see them as being an important part of the network. They're not totally merged, and they're not independent either.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, can I just jump in there quickly? Yeah. I mean, just to say that this was Alexander Litvinenko, who was murdered by the FSB. This was his thesis back in the 1990s. He was the person who really coined the idea of mafia state, in which the FSB, organized crime, and the government kind of merge. And he was actually testifying to Spanish prosecutors about this at the time he was poisoned in 2006, and tracing links between organized crime operational in Southern Europe with the FSB and with people at the very top of the Russian government. And this was all reported back actually in leaked US diplomatic cables. You may have even read them or written them, John. I'm not sure. But essentially that the FSB will instrumentalize organized crime and use it for operations that they want to be deniable. So they will utilize them to do things they can't necessarily be seen to do themselves. But essentially this is one kind of fused quasi-criminal organization.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Brian Vuik. Forgive me if I mispronounced the last name. Does the activity of the FSB in search of profit include proliferation of nuclear materials to the highest bidder, or do Russian internal controls mitigate this risk and lead criminals to choose higher profit, easier targets for their activities? Who would like to address that question?
I could.
Please.
There were, up until the last few years, I haven't followed in the last few years, but through about 2015, you were certainly seeing problems of proliferation of materials moving, particularly through the Caucasus, sometimes on to Turkey. And there were definitely criminals, but there were also what I would call FSB criminals that were involved. So you once again see people with state structure involvement who were involved in the transport of this activity. Who they successfully transferred to is not always clear.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from John Cipher. Do our speakers have any sense over which of the security services wield the most power within the Kremlin? Well, I think the report answers that question. In the 1990s, the SVR had access to foreign banks, smuggling, and money laundering networks. Well, it's clear now that the FSB has a larger domestic economic role. At the same time, there's so much focus in the Western press on the GRU. I assume Putin engages in a political game of divide and conquer, but is the FSB growing too large to control now? Luke, you want to give a shot at this, or Irina?
Irina, do you want to jump in or not?
Please go ahead.
No, Irina, your turn to go first. You go first, off and up.
Okay. I mean, the SVR was instrumental back into the 90s and even later in channeling Russian money into the West to buy some assets and to organize some activities in the West. But given the growing activities of the FSB in financial area, the balance a little bit changed since then. But the question was, what is the most powerful security service in Russia? Yes, I
Well,
think
that was part of it. Yes.
I think in terms of internal policy, this is the FSB because it's simultaneously the security services, it's counterintelligence agency, and it also a huge instrument for control. University, a lot of entities in the country, ministries, agencies, universities, even theaters, because the FSB apparatus, the FSB representatives and some kind of present in every, and literally in many or in most of Russian institutions, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I would just add that also as part of this kind of Game of Thrones, this kind of this perpetual kind of intra-agency rivalry. I mean, the GRU has been hyperactive, but it's also, we have to acknowledge, it's had major setbacks. If you think about what happened with Sergei Skripal in the spring of 2018, where the two GRU assassins, I mean, okay, they almost killed their target, but they gave this humiliating interview subsequently to Russia Today. And I think, I don't know if Irina agrees, but I think the GRU has suffered quite a lot of face domestically. And of course, I mean, we can't know, this is sort of speculative, but the heads of the GRU have this habit of dying in rather mysterious circumstances. I think the last three have died rather abruptly in their early 60s, all because of natural causes. So this, I think, is something the FSB can profit from GRU mistakes.
That's a very interesting observation. And it's worth remembering that one of the things we saw in the Soviet Union upon Stalin's death was kind of an agreement among the elite in the party to avoid repression within the party. Okay. We have a question, let's see, asking about the role of the FSB, if there is a role, in controlling the military. Who'd like to take that? Irina, do you have a thought on that?
The FSB, traditionally, the FSB has a department to control the army and the operation inside the army as it was during the Soviet era, and it is just kind of control over the army. It's I don't know. Army people, Russian military, they don't like the FSB at all. They hate them because the FSB officers usually spoil the life of normal army officers. So so in terms of control the army, the FSB has information and gathering a lot of information inside the army, but in terms of control, the army is under control of the general staff, and they are not subordinated to the FSB, and it's very difficult to the FSB to. They can get some information and they can launch criminal investigation against army officers, but they can't. I don't know. They can't fully control them.
Okay, thank you. Luke, you have anything to add?
No, not on that one, John. No.
Thank you. We have a question from Dan Frieda, a very interesting one. What would be the impact in Russia of sustained and detailed identification of individuals engaged in corrupt activities and self-enrichment as described in the report? I see Luke smiling. Do you want to try that?
Well, I'd like to sort of say that obviously they would feel ashamed and humiliated. They would cease their nefarious activities and hand in their badge and do something beneficial for society. But I don't really see that. I mean, having done, as I said before, having worked with New York Times and others on Panama Papers and Paradise Papers, we found everyone. We found FSB people. We found Dmitry Peskov, Vladimir Putin's press secretary. We found the offshore bank accounts in Switzerland of his wife. And we published these stories to some fanfare, but actually it didn't really change behavior. The Kremlin said that we were all CIA and MI6 operatives, and they carried on stealing. So in a way, I mean, I'm not sure that we can shift the dial domestically. I mean, of course, what Western policymakers can do is to impose sanctions, whether it's on Belarus, whether it's on the FSB elite, whether it's on the people who tried to murder Alexei Navalny or so on. I mean, there are weapons in our toolkit, but I'm not sure appealing to morality or the FSB's better selves is going to work.
Okay. We have a question from Alexander Mihailovich. What is the level of the FSB's involvement in the encouragements of right-wing populist movements in Europe and North America? Any thoughts, Irina, on this?
I don't know, because there was a lot of reports about the involvement of presidential administration into this issue, but I have not seen anything about the FSB activity in Western Europe in terms of far rights activities. No, I just don't know.
Okay, fair enough. We also have a question. Let's see. regarding FSB role in Latin America, specifically in Venezuela. Do we have any clear evidence for that?
There has been Russian organized crime involvement in Latin America for a long time. In neighboring Colombia, we've had cases of Russian involvement in building submarines for the Colombian drug cartels. And there's a lot of criminal connections between Colombia and Venezuela. But these contacts are not new. And when we can see them in people smuggling, we can see their involvement in drug activities, and also significant Russian involvement in money laundering. In fact, there is a major case that occurred in Guatemala that had dramatic impact on anti-corruption efforts in Guatemala. And there was really basically a disinformation campaign against the anti-corruption organization run by Guatemala and the United Nations as a result of finding a Russian group, a Russian family that had been involved in people smuggling and corruption of the Guatemalan government. So they're all involved in different ways. People are not focusing enough on this.
The information about them helping build submarines for Colombian drug cartels, when you say these are criminal elements or criminal/state elements?
Criminal.
Question.
When there's also a wonderful case in the United States of Colombian drug cartel representatives going to Russia. This was very early in the post-Soviet period, and trying to buy sophisticated equipment from Russian state officials.
Very, very. So, okay, two people have asked about the involvement of the FSB in the Moscow Patriarchate of the Russian Orthodox Church at home and abroad in other Orthodox countries. Would anyone like to take this question on? If not, I'm happy to jump in. Irina, go ahead.
The former chief of Russian railways, Yakunin, he was a person. He's a former KGB general and person who was very close to Putin. Now he was a few years ago he was fired from his post, but he was in some kind of in charge for enforcing relationship, strengthening relationship between Orthodox churches across Europe. So he organized conferences, he organized summits on Orthodoxy or something like that in Europe. But he still continues his activities, but he is not as prominent as he used to be now.
Okay, I would simply add to that of course, we know that senior clerics in the Moscow Patriarchate are either in touch with intelligence services, if not actually agents of those intelligence services. All right, I'll take one more question, even though we're now at the witching hour when we're supposed to end. The question from Andrew Bain: what is the role of the FSB in policy making in the near abroad, in Ukraine, in Georgia, in Transnistria? And do FSB business interests influence those policies? Do any of our panelists want to take on that question?
So it should be on me, I guess. Don't know a lot about the FSB financial or economic interest in this region, but the role of FSB is very important in the Ukrainian conflict. But in terms of its economic activities, I just don't know.
Okay, I would simply add. Oh, actually, Louise, you want to jump in?
I just want to say that there certainly has been a very serious problem of criminalization of the Crimea, and since the Soviet invasion, with the Russian invasion of the region, and also there are concerns about links between Georgia and Georgian interests and Russia.
Could you describe briefly the criminalization within Crimea?
There's involvement in people smuggling, arms smuggling, transit point for a lot of illicit goods. Okay, so it's a real hotspot.
I would simply add in response to that question that the FSB and other intelligence agencies in Russia have been very active in the formulation of policy in the near abroad since the Soviet Union fell apart. You had that very interesting period in the early and mid 90s when Yeltsin was pursuing a policy of accord with the United States, with the West, yet somehow Russian policy in the near abroad was quite in conflict with his larger policy towards the West. And we know that the FSB was a principal instrument of that at that time. So we're already 3 minutes over. I thank everybody for listening in. I thank our panelists for wonderful insights. And I'd like to thank again Maria Logan and the Future of Russia Foundation for sponsoring this event. And I hope we'll be able to do additional events on the Russian report and bring more of that report into English in the future. Thank you all very much for a wonderful conversation.